So, we are now up to part 6 in our story of Disney legend Mary Blair, a brilliant designer, illustrator, and watercolorist who many believed was Walt's favorite artist. So far, we've followed both her and her husband Lee from childhood to art school and then to various animation studios around Los Angeles as the art form was beginning to blossom there in the 1930s. As we left off last time, both Lee and Mary were working on projects related to Fantasia. Mary also worked on a project called Penelope and the 12 Clocks, a story that ultimately was never developed into a short film, but in this, Mary developed and drew a wide-eyed girl of about 4 or 5 years old, a girl whose form and appearance radiated joy, patience, and curiosity. Though Mary couldn't have known it then, this figure would be the start of what we might call, in terms of illustration, the Mary Blair children. Uniquely styled figures that would follow her through her career, including up through It's a Small World. As we finished up in our last episode, it was clear that trouble was building both inside and outside the studio, and that is exactly where we begin today. The year 1941 would forever transform the Disney studio with twin interlocking crises. The first crisis concerned the war, which closed key international markets to American films, meaning that some titles, such as Pinocchio, earned a meager profit, while other titles, such as Fantasia, were released at a substantial loss. Beyond the loss of overseas income, the war also changed the national mood in America, where many people were growing concerned that the country would soon be lured into the conflict. Up until this time, Disney had focused its features on European fairy tales such as Snow White and Pinocchio, and European mythology such as sections of Fantasia, which may have reminded some viewers of the war that now blazed overseas. If Disney had one bit of luck fall its way, it was this. Its next 3 features, The Reluctant Dragon, Dumbo, and Bambi, were largely set in America. The Reluctant Dragon was primarily a tour of the newly finished Disney studio in Burbank, even if one of its animated segments was set in England. The early sections of Dumbo were partially set in South Florida before the circus traveled to other unnamed states, and Bambi was set in the woods of Maine. The loss of income contributed to the second crisis. After the tremendous success of Snow White, artists at the Disney studio, particularly those on the lower end of the salary scale, expected bonuses and raises, with the studio's good fortune spread around to all who worked there and specifically to those who had contributed to the film. The financial reality of the Disney company, however, was that after the completion of the new studio lot in Burbank, the organization was quickly moving into debt. Studio managers as well had once believed that subsequent features, though perhaps not reaching the staggering financial success of Snow White, would bring a reasonable profit into the studio, allowing continued feature production, a high level of employment, and likely higher wages for those who worked there, particularly those who proved themselves uniquely valuable in terms of the creation of new films. But with the financial realities of the European war, this now seemed unlikely. Executives at the studio, such as Walt and Roy, clearly understood the looming financial crisis, but many artists at the studio did not. In California, as 1941 began, there were few signs of the coming financial hardships, such as rationing or high inflation. Both of these problems were hovering on the horizon, but at the start of the year, most Disney animators didn't feel the effects of the European war. The strongest visible sign of coming trouble was the National Selective Service Registration for men between the ages of 21 and 35, which had begun the previous October as a contingency in case America found itself in the war. Aside from this, though, young artists at the studio didn't yet see the financial consequences of the war in their personal lives, so many simply assumed that the studio was still flush with cash and was using the overseas conflict as an excuse to deny them raises and promotions. The assumption that Walt Disney Productions was well off was for many solidified by the upper-end amenities at the studio, including the lush grounds, the commissary that offered room service, the penthouse club and exercise gym, the tea room, and a baseball diamond, even though all of these had been arranged into the plans many months before the war burned across Europe. Beyond this, the office arrangements, furnishings, and various offerings made clear that lead artists were far better paid than junior artists. More senior artists tended to receive assignments that spoke to creativity, while younger artists tended to receive assignments to finish off work started or envisioned by others. The issue of screen credit, specifically whose names were listed in the finished film and whose weren't, made clear that the work of some artists was more valued than that of others. Lastly, the floor plan for offices, with Walt now on the top floor at the far side of the animation building, made artists on other floors and in other buildings feel cut off from the power center of film production. For the most part, Disney artists separated into two groups. The older and more senior artists, typically those with higher salaries, remained loyal to Walt and the studio, while younger artists tended to support a newly formed union that advocated for a work stoppage until its members were better paid. Because Walt Disney Productions was a young company, the distinction in age, for the most part, between more and less senior artists was often only that of a decade. More senior artists, who typically started at the studio before work began on Snow White, were in their 30s, while junior artists, typically hired to finish Snow White or work on subsequent films, were mostly in their 20s. By the start of 1941, a relatively new union called the Screen Cartoon Guild organized the Disney studio toward union membership and collective bargaining, amplifying the belief that company executives were keeping too much of the studio's income for themselves. In memos and meetings, Walt repeatedly explained that the war in Europe had depleted their fortunes. He also promised that artists would eventually receive raises and promotions based on the quality of their work, though the subtext here was that this would happen after foreign markets reopened to American films and the studio returned to profitability. In various meetings outside the view of general employees, Walt explored contingency plans to keep his artists engaged. The studio might make training films for the military or military-related industries. It might also make propaganda films for the U.S. and Canada to elevate national morale. By this point, Canada, as part of the British Commonwealth, had already entered the war. Walt was under the belief that the U.S. would soon follow. These films, he thought, might prove an important new revenue stream to keep all of his artists fully employed. Throughout February, March, and April, Walt and other managers at the studio informed artists of the looming crisis as they understood it. Many junior artists believed that this was nothing more than smoke and mirrors, an obvious attempt to conceal the financial health of the studio by pointing to German aggression in Europe. Some artists went so far as to call Walt's pleas a sob story. By May, the divisions between these two groups, studio loyalists and studio unionists, were so deep that many employees were uncomfortable on the lot. The camp of loyalists generally felt that they were viewed by the unionists as elitist and exclusionary. The camp of unionists felt that they were viewed as troublemakers and complainers. Along these uncomfortable divides, artists worked until the union could arrange a vote to strike. Lee and Mary were in neither camp. Lee hadn't been at the studio long enough to have deep loyalties to Walt, and moreover, Lee felt that Walt was brusque and a bastard at times. But Lee was also paid far more and had more experience than many of the newer recruits in their 20s. Not connecting deeply with either side, Lee mostly watched the strike from a distance. The strike was mainly about the animation department, Lee said. We were working on stories. Union leaders made no attempt to organize us. In this, he indicated that likely because of his age and experience, the union tended to group him with the loyalists. Lee also tended to socialize more with established artists who supported Walt, even if he personally had some managerial differences with him. Mary, on the other hand, had been barely at the studio for a year when union managers called for a strike vote. By this point, she had a growing personal relationship with Walt. She sensed he supported her work. But the budding aggression focused on the strike was disorienting, a system that asked her to choose a side even though she hadn't been at the studio long enough to have strong feelings one way or the other. In late May, the union held a strike vote, a proposal that passed with strong support from its members. Once the results were announced, Walt promised that he would protect those artists who still chose to work at the studio despite the ongoing labor action. A full and adequate protection will be given to those who wish to continue working, Walt said. We have received assurance from the authorities that there will be protection against disorder. On May 29th, hundreds of Disney employees arrived at the studio at 6 a.m. to create picket lines around its gates, largely to garner public and press support and also to scare off those wishing to enter the studio to work. Strikers held signs featuring Disney characters. One sign featuring a drawing of Pinocchio announced, "There are no strings on me." Another featuring Jiminy Cricket said, "Tain't cricket to pass a picket." Other signs simply said, "Disney unfair." Initially, Lee and Mary both came to work during the strike, as did many of Mary's friends at the studio, including Retta Scott. The first day, as Lee and Mary approached the studio, they found roughly 200 fellow artists arranged in lines outside the lot. Legally, strikers could not physically prevent others from coming to work, but through their taunts and jeers, they certainly made it difficult for those choosing to side with Walt in the studio. Because Lee saw himself as the financial center of his marriage, he likely felt he had no realistic option other than to continue at the studio or find a different job. Mary, over the past few years, had repeatedly moved between studio work and work on her own paintings. She made it for 15 days, coming to the studio, seeing those out front, and then, once inside, focusing on her own assignments. But after the second full week of the strike, she handed in her resignation, as clearly this was too much for her. She resigned on June 13, 1941. At that time, her salary was $67.50 per week, indicating that she was not only in the upper half of studio salaries, but also that Walt, while some managers were forced to take pay cuts, had so valued her work that during this difficult time, he had found a way to recently give her a 12.5% raise. Neither Lee nor Mary ever talked much about the strike in interviews or letters. But once in a 1944 exchange, when asked about it, Mary explained, 2 years there at Disney's, interesting, but not enough to sidetrack my first ambition and art school-formed aspiration, illustration. So I quit in the summer of 1941. Also, in an interview, Lee would later confirm, I think Mary left because of the strike. With this, Mary returned to their hilltop house to paint in the third-story office with windows opening to the hills, while Lee continued each weekday to drive to the studio. He would later comment that the strike, along with all of its social divisions, caused a lot of hard feelings. While the studio remained on strike, and while America inched toward the inevitable war, Walt looked for other non-theatrical revenue streams to support his studio. What was clear by this point was that feature animation would at best produce a minimal profit and at worst a loss until the war was over. If Walt wanted to protect his company from bankruptcy and to keep his artists together and employed, he needed to arrange alternate sources of income. Already he had explored, and to some extent arranged to produce training and propaganda films paid for by outside entities. But during the spring of 1941, he investigated another option, a cooperative venture between the studio and a government agency, the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, which promoted political unity between North, Central, and South America against Nazi and Axis powers. This plan came together with a tentative agreement just as Mary was resigning from the studio. Through the Office of the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, or the CIAA, the United States worked to shore up support for the Allies and create a hemispheric defense against Nazi powers during a time in which some countries, particularly Brazil and Argentina, were showing signs of pro-German support, and other countries, such as Mexico, remained politically neutral and engaged in trade with Germany. Previously, the CIAA had partnered with Hollywood studios and national radio networks to include positive references to Latin America and appearances by Latin American stars and musicians in commercial films and radio programs distributed throughout the Americas as a means of managing public opinion, largely to suggest that the United States viewed the countries of Central and South America as political and economic partners. The CIAA also arranged Latin American tours with American celebrities, including an early tour by Bing Crosby, to influence political and cultural opinions in Central and South American countries. But the CIAA's early efforts were met with minimal success. The plan arranged between Walt and the CIAA was far more ambitious. The Disney studio would create a dozen short cartoons set in Central and South American locations to showcase local culture and customs in a positive light, also blending established Disney characters such as Donald and Goofy, whose nationality was largely viewed as American, with newly created Disney characters who lived in Central and South America, thereby emphasizing the concept of Pan-American unity. All of the cartoons would be set in specific cities or regions of Central and South America. The plan as it evolved would be more ambitious than previous Hollywood CIAA partnerships. Walt and a few of his artists would embark on a multi-month trip to Central and South America as well as to Mexico, fully paid for by the CIAA and its corporate partners. Walt would function largely as a goodwill ambassador from the U.S. with multiple public appearances, while his artists and managers assembled materials for those dozen proposed cartoons. Some members of the Disney studio would focus on music that might be included in the films, while visual artists would largely interpret and present local culture in drawings and paintings in an attempt to develop materials to present an authentic representation of Latin American regions and cities on screen. The Disney artists would also take 16mm footage of their travels that might be edited into a documentary. Because these assignments were viewed as pre-planning or early vision work for later cartoons, Walt primarily chose two types of employees for this strip. First, story artists to develop narrative materials based on their research, and second, concept artists who could translate the region into a set of images that could be adapted for a Disney look in later cartoons. Among the visual artists initially selected for the trip were James Bordrero, a Disney concept artist who had a lifelong interest in Central and South America, Herb Ryman, an extremely talented art director who had previously worked at MGM and would be useful in translating realistic settings into materials that would play well in animation, and Lee Blair, a concept artist and colorist who, before joining the Disney studio in 1938, had spent weeks in Mexico translating local culture and geographic beauty into a series of watercolors that he later showed in both Los Angeles and New York galleries. Along with the concept artists, one animator, Frank Thomas, was included, likely to develop characters that would represent various regions. In June and July 1941, as Lee drove into the studio each day, easing through picket lines arranged around studio gates, Mary remained at home, where she worked on her own paintings. She also invited her parents to come down and spend many weeks at their house, as their house was massive, far larger than needed by Mary and Lee. Her mother and father likely arrived in July for an extended stay, while plans for the Latin American trip percolated at the studio. When inviting artists onto the trip, Walt generally spoke with them one at a time to discuss his plans. One day Walt called me in, Lee explained, and said they were going to go to South America. Lee's job there would be to translate South and Central American locations into watercolors and drawings in such a way viewers could easily understand local culture. It was an ideal job for him, as this was exactly what he and Mary had done through the California Scene movement, visually translating the energy, joys, and anxieties of their home culture into a series of watercolors. He and Mary had also done this in Mexico, but Lee understood the trip would likely cause a problem in his marriage, especially if he went on a research and painting trip and left Mary at home. That night, he went home to find that Mary was spending time with her parents. He explained that he and about a dozen other Disney artists and employees had been invited to go on an extended trip to South and Central America, spending significant time in Rio and Buenos Aires, as well as taking short trips to other regions. "I'm going to go to South America with Disney," he said. "No kidding," Mary replied, but Lee could see lines of disappointment appear in her face. "She got all upset because she wasn't going to go along," he later explained. Mary's father, John Robinson, then 63 years old, took her aside. He was a kind man, his sparse hair now gray, his body composed of soft curves. Likely they discussed the possibility of Lee asking Walt if she might accompany them, but in that arrangement she would be seen more as a wife or as a companion rather than as a key member of the artistic team. "Well, Mary," Mr. Robinson said, "why don't you get yourself all dressed up and go over to the studio and make an appointment with Mr. Disney and tell him that you want to go too?" Mary agreed and made an appointment to meet with Walt. Almost surely, as Mary drove over to the studio, she was confronted with the picket line. Even after 2 months of a strike, long lines of artists showed up with signs expressing their anger about pay and the lack of promotions. Inside the gates, though, hundreds of employees still showed up to work, hoping to finish Dumbo for a holiday release, which many employees now saw as the difference between Disney staying financially solvent and falling into bankruptcy. Even from where she parked, she would have been able to see the line of strikers on the other side of the fence moving single file along the street. She found Walt in his third-story office suite, a set of rooms with a sitting area, a formal office, and a work office. At the moment, Walt had 3 artists capable of producing fine concept work going on the trip. Mary then explained her unique qualifications for this work, that for years she had sought to translate culture into watercolors. 3 years earlier, she had also toured Mexico with the express purpose of capturing regional culture there with her brush. That is, She had unique experiences that would benefit the overall project. But there was one thing beyond Mary's qualifications that must have existed then in the room with them. The fact that beyond those concept artists already going on the trip, specifically Herb Ryman, James Pedrero, and of course Lee, Walt had other highly trained concept artists actively working at his studio. Among them were Sylvia Holland and Ethel Kulser, both of whom had produced exceptional work and who had longer connections to the Disney organization. Holland had worked there for 3 years, Kulser for nearly 5. After Mary made her request, Walt considered it, and then he agreed to add Mary to the group. In doing so, he tacitly revealed that he had a stronger connection to Mary than he did to other artists, and that he saw elements of interest in her work that he likely didn't see in the work of other studio employees. He placed Mary as an artist who had recently quit above other highly qualified artists still employed at the studio. Lee and Mary would not be the only couple on the excursion. There would be 4 couples overall. 2 couples had Disney family connections. Walt brought his wife Lillian, and Bill Cottrell brought his wife Hazel, who was Lillian's sister. And 2 other couples contained partners who had worked at the Disney studio for years. Assistant art director Larry Landsberg, who was married to studio publicist Janet Martin, and of course Lee and Mary Blair, the only working artist who had not been an employee at the time the trip was planned. With this, Mary was now going on a 2-month excursion to South and Central America. She would be formally rehired at the studio on Monday, August 11th, the first full workday of the trip. In the months leading up to the trip, story artists had outlined possible narratives relying on material they found in books, magazines, and other research areas. By August, they had far more options than were needed. Among the story team, the general consensus was that some ideas wouldn't pan out once the group was on the ground and could better see how well some narratives, along with the region where they were set, would fit the visual tones of a Disney cartoon. In this, the general goal for concept artists and for the one animator, Frank Thomas, was to visually define locations, costumes, props, and characters that could be used in Disney cartoons later developed when everyone was back home at the studio. Among the narratives that circulated through the story department were one about an ostrich who had laid a golden egg, another about a singing horse, one about a penguin named Paul who didn't like the cold, one about a donkey who could fly, another about a veined firefly, and various stories about a tortoise, parrots, and Lulu the little llama. The impulse was to present South and Central America largely through landscapes and cartoons, not so much with realistic people. Mary's primary job was to capture the colors and culture of the regions they visited in watercolors, while animator Frank Thomas and others focused on the creation of possible characters. Beyond a small folder of narrative ideas, Disney had also developed cultural notes on each of the key countries, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, to guide artists toward creating accurate presentations of each region. Notes that focused on meals, living conditions, music, popular dance, and religion. For Argentina, as an example, the Disney Research Guide offered this particular advice. Luncheon, as in the United States, is usually served at 1 o'clock. Tea is drunk at a later hour than with us because of the later dinner hour. One is usually invited for dinner at 9 o'clock. In terms of culture, it explained, Argentina is Roman Catholic, very Roman Catholic, and any attempt to picture the Argentine people must take into account their strong religious conviction. The research folder also listed nearly every animal, from the howling monkey to the anteater to the capybara, that the artists might use as possible characters in Disney cartoons. Some of these cultural elements, along with landscape features, would also need to be absorbed in both Mary and Lee's watercolors. For the Blairs, the trip began on Sunday, August 10th. They met 7 other artists and studio employees at the Lockheed Terminal in North Burbank, though other artists had either already departed for South America or would soon leave. Even though it was summer in North America, the group was dressed in winter clothes, suitable for far cooler temperatures in Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires. The group flew on a propeller-driven DC-3 to Indianapolis, and from there they took a second flight to Miami, where they spent a day largely dressed in wool outfits exploring the sights by the sea. The following morning, as the sun lifted above the horizon, the Blairs arrived at the airport to continue their multi-day journey south, with a flight that touched down for the night in Trinidad. By this point, they were now thousands of miles from the studio where the strike continued, but there was now another concern. Though in the States the Disney Group had seen few signs of the war, once they were over international waters, they became increasingly aware of wartime conditions. All commercial flights needed to land before dusk, as they weren't allowed to fly at night, and likewise when planes took off and landed, all windows needed to be covered in case there was an enemy spy on board wishing to identify security weak points at regional airports that might be used in a later attack. From Trinidad the next morning, the group flew to Belém, where they would spend one night in a town at the edge of the jungle. Before dinner, Janet Martin explained, some of us sat at the little sidewalk tables in front of the hotel, and Mary Blair sketched some of the little kids around. Within minutes, there was a small group pressing in to see her drawings. This was the group's first understanding that, with their stylish American clothes and their connections to the Disney studio, they too would be minor celebrities. The group of 9 Disney employees didn't arrive in Rio until Thursday, August 14th. 4 days after leaving Burbank. It was an overcast day with a gloomy marine layer covering the ocean, but still they now felt they were in South America. There they met the 2 advanced members of their team, Jack Cutting, who oversaw international distribution, and John Rose, head of story research, who had flown ahead to finalize hotel reservations and various agenda items. The full Disney group, including Walt and his wife Lillian, didn't arrive in Rio until Sunday afternoon, August 17th, where they were met by 2,000 onlookers who crowded around the airfield to catch a glimpse of the famous American studio head. There was a big crowd waiting for him, Janet Martin explained, and when he stepped off the plane, everybody went crazy and waved and cheered and really gave him a reception. The unexpectedly large crowd was a sign that the goodwill aspects of this trip would be successful, with Brazilians already expressing a strong admiration for Walt Disney. But with the arrival of the full team, there were now some changes to the itinerary and to work roles. The first had to do with hotel arrangements. The original plan was to have the entire group stay at the Copacabana Palace Hotel, situated on the beach, but the advanced team of John Rose and Jack Cutting had discovered that there had been an issue securing enough rooms at the palace, largely because hotel rooms were occupied by those fleeing Europe due to the war. Walt and Lillian, along with his brother-in-law Bill Cottrell and Lillian's sister Hazel, would stay at the palace, while the rest of them would stay a few miles north at the Hotel Gloria. This was the first thing that slightly irritated Lee. Walt was in the Copacabana beach, Lee explained, and the rest of the proletariat artists were in the Hotel Gloria, which was closer to the center of town. In defining artists as the working proletariat, by extension, Lee was suggesting that Walt and the Disney family members were entitled or elite. The next had to do with secondary responsibilities, which Walt now adjusted. One of these assignments was to capture 16mm footage of the trip that could be arranged into a short documentary. Walt himself, a fine amateur cinematographer, would capture some of the footage. Along with him, this duty was given to Larry Landsberg, who had worked in live-action productions at other studios, and initially to Herb Ryman, an art director who had also worked with live action. It was assumed that even though neither were trained cinematographers, their experience with live action would prove beneficial in creating documentary footage. But after considering each person's strengths, Walt reassigned the 16mm camera originally intended for Herb Ryman to Lee, so Ryman could focus more on his art. Both men would still draw and paint, but Lee would now spend part of his time with a camera. In this, Walt silently indicated that he thought Ryman's production of art was likely more valuable to the project than the art produced by Lee. In all this, Lee could see that Walt was growing increasingly fond of his wife's watercolors, elevating her work, and at the same time he was slightly downgrading Lee's efforts, suggesting that Ryman's contributions might have higher value. This, too, quietly rankled Lee, but still he accepted the new job and remained in good spirits, largely focused, like the rest of the group, on the incredible journey ahead. From there, the group started to take in Rio. There was some beautiful scenery, Bill Cottrell explained. I guess Rio Harbor is one of the most beautiful harbors in the world. Lee was drawn to the elaborate public areas. The sidewalks are all different colors of mosaic tile, he explained. It's mostly curving patterns. Frank Thomas observed, being in Rio was a great treat for the senses. There just seemed to be decorative stuff everywhere, and the big palm trees, and the people also happy. The group was constantly drawing, constantly painting, trying to take in everything they saw. We had people like Mary Blair, Herb Ryman, Jack Miller, and Lee Blair, who were very fast artists, Frank Thomas explained. They'd make sketches of the foliage and took lots of photos, and they'd draw along the way, sort of getting ideas. Janet Martin explained that the group drew typical Brazilian animals, birds, flowers, trees, and street scenes, actually laying the groundwork for some short subjects. One goal, according to Bill Cottrell, was to find a story that typifies Brazil as being distinct from other countries. Walt recognized the color of Brazil. He went everywhere there, to the zoo, to the gardens, to people's homes. Walt was enthused at Rio for its beauty, at Brazil for its music and gaiety. Around the Disney groups were the colors, the shapes, and the aromas of an unfamiliar country, a rich assortment of sensual experiences that the artists were trying to capture in images. You go to bed with the exciting rhythms of the samba pounding through your veins, Janet Martin explained, and eventually you're standing around somewhere and you find yourself going into the little knee-bending swinging samba step all by yourself. Each of the artists was affected by their surroundings, a new sense of life, a new way of expressing joy and excitement. But one of the artists warmed slightly more to these sensations than the others. That artist was Mary Blair. She allowed her old, Chenard-centered understanding about art to fall away as she took in the world around her with sensitivity and experimentation. The colors, the shadings, even the shapes she had used to capture the moods of California's streets now needed to be put aside so that new colors and shapes could enter her paintings, ones that hopefully would visually express the unique feeling of life that now swirled around the group. It was an experiment, but one that was slowly capturing her artistic sensibilities, a visual sense of wonder and joy that again was pushing her art in new directions. I'll be back next week with a new episode. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney Studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney Company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.